Today I'm editing 6 raw images that other photographers have sent in to me so I can add my own creative artistic flair, for no other reason than I love editing and bringing images to life. All of these photographers are very talented in their own right, both behind the camera and during the editing process. So it's not about doing things better, because art is completely subjective. There is no right or wrong way, just individual creative expression. So I'll stop waffling, let's dive straight in. Now this image was sent in by John Rogerson. Check out his Instagram feed and show him some love. Nice moody image of a seaside town clock, and this is going to be all about the sky. Shot at 800th of a second, f5 and ISO 100. So let's begin by reducing the highlights to bring back some of the detail in the distant sky. And a touch of clarity to enhance the mood. Now, I'm all about the tone curve in editing these days because it's the most powerful singular editing tool you have at your disposal. So I'm going to be using this a lot during the video. I'm just going to drag the black point in a touch. Moving on to some mask work and choosing sky, let's bring down those highlights even further. Same with the blacks and maybe a hint of blue temperature. Now the sky is much lighter in the right corner, and I'd like to use a linear gradient to draw the eye towards the center of the picture. But I don't want this affecting the clock itself, so using intersect mask with subject, we can invert the mask so only the sky portion is selected. Now we can use the tone curve again and level out the exposure with the black point and some whites. A reduction in exposure, some more blacks, and don't worry about those oversaturated blues, I'll fix those in just a sec. A nice increase in contrast, and of course bring down that nasty blue saturation. And let's just take some of that grungy texture away along with clarity. And it's amazing how much detail is captured in a raw file when you thought there was none. Perhaps a touch less saturation, and that's looking pretty good. At the bottom of the image, let's add another linear gradient so we can darken down the foreground using the exposure slider and the black slider. And I think the buildings over on the left side are pulling too much focus away from the clock, so using a radial gradient, we can darken down this as well. Now for the main attraction. Using select subject, Lightroom does a pretty decent job, a little overspill on the railing, so let's subtract using a brush and paint away that. Now we can use the white point of the curve to make it stand out from the sky. Bring the shadows down, and that's looking more important in the scene. But I'd actually like to make the pillar have a more three-dimensional shape. So using a brush mask, make sure we are feathered all the way to 100. And let's just zoom out a touch. And making the brush about the same size as the pillar, dab on the left-hand side, and using the Shift key on your keyboard, dab at the top to create a perfect straight line. Now we can intersect with the subject and darken the exposure on the left side. A touch of blacks, and now we have more directional light and shape on that clock pillar. And all that's left to do is open the image in Photoshop and straighten the image with the crop tool. Making sure content aware fill is selected, we can expand the left side slightly so the clock is absolutely center stage. And we've gone from a moody afternoon photograph to a stormy, dramatic scene with punch and focus fully on that clock tower. Now, John sent in another gorgeous scene which was very well executed, managing to freeze that running man with shadow perfectly in the window frame. I do love window scenes because of the abstract reflections you can get. Not a lot needed on this image, although the framing was slightly drawing my attention to the corner of the window, where the other window does include the round window frame, so I think I'm going to crop it down to here and rotate it to straighten the image. And what this does is leave your imagination and your mind's eye to fill in the roundness for you. Also, the runner is now center stage on that rule of thirds line. Basic adjustments are going to be minimal. A touch of dehaze, a small amount of blacks using the tone curve, and onto color to bring life into the scene. Let's really enhance those warm tones. Greens we don't need. Aquas can increase. Blues around -35. And no real need for purples or magentas. Now, because oranges and tealy blues complement each other so well on the color spectrum, Let's change the hues of the blues more towards that aqua. Now onto color grading. The shadows will benefit from those nice warm tones again, adding to the complementary colors, and highlights really push that teal color. It's giving me a real vintage vibe like those old Fujifilm colors. Now for just 2 gradient masks, first on the foreground, just up to where the pavement ends. Now we can add a touch of warm temperature and tint. Maybe push the shadows up and blacks down to add contrast. And one last gradient mask to darken down the corner of the room using the blacks. It's such a great capture by John with well thought out composition and execution of that running man through the window. I kind of wish I'd taken this image myself. Now here we have a bunch of images sent in by Mark Duffy, a great all-round photographer and thoroughly nice chap who has his own YouTube channel, so check him out. As well as the portrait which we'll look at, he also sent in a multiple exposure scene which I'm going to exposure blend together in just a minute. First, let's look at the portrait of this lovely girl called Neve, and you can find her at You're Lawless on Instagram. Now this is a great image, not a lot needed with editing except perhaps a retouch and some enhancements. Now I'm not going to show you the entire retouching process because that would take far too long, and I have dedicated videos on retouching, so I'll pop links to those in the description or up above here. But in Photoshop, here was my process. I did a stage 1 retouch to eliminate some of the dark circles around her eyes, and using a standard frequency separation technique to smooth out the skin. So let's just see that again. Also, I matched the lip color to the background foliage. Once again. Now you can see that I brightened her teeth as well. Now the next stage in this retouch is to let the image sit for a while. I often like to step away from the computer for maybe 5 minutes, 15, or maybe a few hours, because once you return, you'll always notice things that you missed the first time around, which is why I like to do a second stage retouch. Now here I use the liquify tool to add a touch of volume to the top of the hair. Also, I brightened the iris of the eyes and sorted some of the skin texture around the laughter line area of the face. Let's do a few before and afters. I removed some of the flyaway hairs on her forehead and removed some of the specular highlights on the teeth. The final stage was to add a kind of artistic lens flare effect to the top left corner for a dreamlike quality. Let's turn off the mask real quick and take the blending option back to normal to show you what it is. Basically, it's just a golden graduated circle on a black background. Then the mask was to eliminate the face area and set the blending option to screen, which takes away the black, leaving us with this gorgeous retouched portrait fit for a cosmetics beauty campaign that you might see on L'Oreal, Christian Dior, or Chanel posters. Now, before we move on to Mark Duffy's other image, which is kindly sent in, if you're watching this editing tutorial, you're hopefully gaining some valuable knowledge from me sharing my skills, which brings me on to today's sponsor, which is Skillshare. And if you haven't come across it before, where have you been? Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives. Covering a wide range of subjects, there are literally thousands of classes to choose from for all levels, designed by creatives for creatives. You can learn or advance your skills at your own pace with this brilliant on-demand platform. Photography is obviously a keen subject for me, but I've also been interested in some of their other subjects, including film, productivity, and social media, like this video on how to start and grow your YouTube channel. By following one of your preferred subjects' learning paths, you can go from amateur to pro in a matter of hours as you work your way through these carefully formulated class collections. As a content creator, I'm always looking for creative growth. And what better time than during the summer? Work and school slow down a bit. It's the perfect time to explore, develop, and level up those skills, hobbies, and passions. So if this is just up your street, Skillshare are offering a 1 month free trial for the first 500 people who click the link in the description below. So don't hang about. Become a member today and join this amazing creative community on Skillshare. Let's take a look at Mark Duffy's other image, which he's kindly sent in a multiple exposure of the same scene, all taken with varying shutter speeds. And finally using his own finger to block out the sun, which eliminates the unwanted lens flare that you can see on these images. This is a technique I've used myself many times. Oh, and here's a behind the scenes image of his camera and his settings. So to begin with, I'm going to take these first 5 images and create a photo merge using HDR. I'll keep all of the standard default settings and click merge. Here's the process bar, and after a couple of seconds, we have our merged HDR image, which in my opinion looks a bit unnatural. We still have those lens flares, which doesn't look good, and the overall lack of contrast makes this image quite flat. And this is where Mark's last image with the finger comes into play. You'll see that the water is smooth in this image because the exposure was longer than the others at 1 second. So what I'm going to do is take the HDR merge and the final image and right click and edit layers in Photoshop. Now the first thing we need to do is zoom in and see if those images align, which they do not. The C-stack has a slight variation because of camera movement on Mark's tripod between images, and this is pretty common if you're on soft ground like grass. So selecting both the layers, let's align them using Edit and Auto Align Layers. Leave it on Auto and click OK. And that sorted that little problem. Next, I'm going to move the HDR layer below the finger image and create a mask on this layer. Now using a soft black brush, I'm going to manually reveal the sunset from the layer beneath. And the feathered brush makes a nice transition between the 2 images. I'm also going to reveal some of the brighter parts of the cliff edge that protrude. And this gives us a more 3-dimensional effect with good natural contrast between the light and dark parts of the image. And doing this by hand actually makes it feel more like a work of art, choosing where to dodge and burn rather than leaving it to the software to decide. Maybe just on the cliff top here and some selected areas on the foreground grass. Now, how much better does this look from the HDR image that Lightroom produced for us? Way more realistic in my opinion. Maybe some of these bits down here. No, it's looking good. Let's do some color work using a selective color adjustment layer. Using the red channel, making things much warmer with the reds, magentas, and yellows, maybe 30%. A quick before and after. And one final thing I'm going to do is stamp down layers using Control, Alt, Shift, and E. And I'm going to convert this layer into a smart object and open this image up in Luminar Neo, which is either a standalone editing platform or a plugin for Photoshop. So let's head into the editing module and choose Water Enhancer. And this is a new feature on the latest update of Luminar Neo, and I covered this in a previous video, so I'll pop links in the description for that. And let's increase the amount to 50%. And you can see the AI selection, which is pretty accurate. But let's tweak the settings to add a bit more complementary greens, blending the original colors through, and finally brightening to around 25%. And that just defines the body of water nicely within a few seconds. And then you can simply click apply and send it back into Photoshop, all within that smart object that we created earlier. And that's how I create multiple exposures with combinations of HDR merge and manual dodge and burn techniques. So next up we have some automotive photography sent in by a talented chap called Patrick Reinholds. And here's his Instagram feed, great shots in there. We have some rolling shots, some light painting, but here's the image that I'm going to look at, a rolling Tesla shot. Now you can see that the color of the car is a matte green, but the bonnet and the windscreen are giving us a lot of blues, which, could be a white balance issue, but let's try to level things out. Using a mask and select subject, Lightroom has found the main object in the scene. Now let's push the tint more towards the green spectrum and perhaps a touch of blue. Now let's use the extraordinary power of curves to add some contrast, pushing the midtones and returning the shadows back to their original position. Now I'm going to push the saturation, which has made the paintwork pop, but the windscreen and the alloy wheels look pretty bad. So what I'm going to do is create a new mask using the brush feature and mask out those areas. Take the saturation all the way down, takes away some of the windscreen glare. Here's a before and after on the work we've done to the car. Much more focus now on that car. Next, I'm going to add a graduated filter to the bottom of the scene to draw the eye towards the car. So using a linear gradient just up to the bottom of the car, Nice reduction in midtones using the curves once again, and some dehaze. Now for some color mixer work. First, I'm going to begin by desaturating all of the individual colors so we can introduce them back gradually. Reds, not much going on there. Oranges, there are some in the background. Yellows, there are plenty in the foliage, but I'll be adjusting those hues on the yellows in just a minute. Greens, let's bring back to 0. Aqua, maybe around -30. Blues, again, there are some present in the bonnet of the car, but I'll level things out with the hue slider shortly. -30, and I'm pretty sure purple and magenta won't be required. Now onto the hues. Yellows and greens, I'd like to push more towards that autumnal vibe with those warmer tones. And let's level out those blues to match the greens in the rest of the car. Finally, luminance. Let's play around with the aquas and the blues in the car to add a small amount of contrast. Now on to color grading. I'm going to introduce some blues into the shadow areas. There looks pretty good, and I might head back into that original subject selection mask and tweak the whites even further for more contrast. Now let's deal with the obvious problem in this image, which is the support car from which the photo was taken. Opening up in Photoshop, let's try selecting the object using the lasso tool and heading up to Edit and Content Aware Fill to see what happens. Now, it's not a bad effort, although the direction of the speeding road is all over the place, and I think we can do better. Opening up the image in Luminar Neo and using the new Gen Erase feature. Let's again select the offending car, and a much better result with the road flowing in the correct direction. It is a bit bright, so let's use a develop adjustment layer and head into masking, linear gradient to darken down the exposure to match the rest of the road. And we've gone from a really good photo taken by Patrick and turned it into an image that you might see for an advertising campaign for a sports car. Now I think we've got time for one last edit, and I've prepared a bunch of masks which I'll show you in just a second. But first I'll change some of the hues to make the vibe more autumnal to match the last image, turning those greens and yellows warmer and the reds in the bright lights more intense. Saturation on those yellows can come all the way up to +90, greens and blues around -50 each. Now let me show you the masking work, starting with the subject isolation of the car itself, where I would simply push the temperature and tint sliders a little cooler, perhaps increase the whites for more contrast, and saturate the overall colors. Mask 2, you can see from the overlay, was there for reducing down the highlights in the back window to get rid of some of that glare. Mask 3, which covers the back window, number plate and wheels, handles the saturation to get rid of some of those bluey greens from the previous mask. Mask 4 was an object selection where I painted around the brake lights, adding some warm temperature, and in the curve section, really adding some reds and yellows in those respective channels, resulting in much more intense brake lights. Mask 5 added a nice graduated filter to the bottom of the image to darken things down using some exposure and bending the curve downwards with a complete reduction in saturation. Now, Mask 6 is what really brings this image to life. It was a radial filter positioned across the top left portion of the image, which intersected with the car as to not be included in the mask. Then simply dragging up the master curve black point. This creates a misty background effect, especially with a hint of blue temperature, and it creates this really good subject isolation. Mask 7 added a radial gradient on the distant horizon line for more warmth using the temperature slider, and a boost on the white slider. And finally, Mask 8 in the top right corner also adds warmth to enhance that autumnal vibe that I was going for. And perhaps some blues in the shadow areas using the color grading wheels. And you know, I think a global shift in temperature to around 6,000 Kelvin should do the trick. Here is that final edit. So when I'm tackling any kind of photo editing, I'm always looking for contrast. I'm looking for subject isolation and color harmony to tie everything together, lips, background, etc. Big thanks to today's photographers for sending in their images and entrusting me not to mess them up. Don't forget to check out Skillshare and that link in the description to that 1 month's free trial. I have a headshot photography course if you're interested in portrait photography. I talk about the camera settings, lighting, the business, and of course the retouching process as well. So I'll leave all of those links in the description. All that's left for me to say is thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more photography content and give us a like if you would please, and I'll see you on the flip side.